From the earliest days of cinema to modern-day horror, there is one character who has always survived it all. They've made it out bloodied, battered, and bruised. She's the final girl, the last one standing, the one who fights back and lives to tell the tale. But who is she really? And how has she evolved over the years? Let's take a deeper look into this iconic trope and explore the ways it's changed from early slashers into today's subversive horror. To understand the final girl's evolution, we first need to go back to the 70s. This era of cinema blossomed into the birthplace of the modern slasher horror film, using masked killers and escalating gore to introduce audiences to a new type of protagonist. She was more than just the traditional damsel in distress. Instead, she became resourceful and smart. Often, she became the moral center of the story. The term final girl was first coined by film scholar Carol J. Clover in her 1992 book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws. In it, Clover identifies this character type as a blend of strength and innocence. The final girl is typically contrasted with her friends, who are depicted as sexually promiscuous and reckless, which makes her survival, in some way, a moral triumph. Take Laurie Strode, the iconic final girl from the 1978 classic Halloween. Not only is she the last one standing, she's the most responsible, the most grounded. Laurie's ability to avoid temptation and think strategically is ultimately what allows her to survive Michael Myers' violent rampage. Her virginal purity, while sometimes criticized as a simple moralistic device, also aligned with the cultural moment, one of conservative ideals about sex, gender, and morality that was powerful in shaping American cinema. Throughout the 1980s, the slasher genre exploded. Films became increasingly violent, gory, and more formulaic. The final girl was now a fixture of the horror genre, appearing in countless projects. But even though the character type stayed, something subtle was shifting. While many final girls held true to the virgin arc, others began to feature more complex characteristics. They weren't always innocent or purely moral. First and foremost, they were survivors. Whether they were flawed, conflicted, or even sexually active, they still had the strength to overpower their killers. Look at Nancy Thompson from A Nightmare on Elm Street. She's smart, but she's also bold and determined. Nancy actively seeks out Freddy Krueger, turning the tables and making her survival a battle of wills, rather than a passive act of fate. In this era, the final girl was moving away from the ideas of purity and into one of resilience and agency. By the 1990s, the horror genre was self-aware. The slasher boom came to a halt, and filmmakers were looking to subvert the genre's conventions. Enter Scream, a film that not only revitalized the slasher, but also gave a direct commentary on the very idea that is the final girl. Sidney Prescott is savvy to the rules of horror movies, a direct reflection of the generation that had grown up watching these films. She's aware of the stereotypes and tropes, and she uses her knowledge to bend the rules. Here, the final girl was no longer a passive survivor. She was an active participant in her own fate. This self-awareness, and the humor that came with it, marked a shift within the final girl trope. She was no longer just a symbol of moral purity. She was now a survivor who understood the stakes and played the game. The 90s also introduced us to more unconventional takes, such as in the Blair Witch Project, where horror evolved out of blood and gore into psychological torment. The final girl, Heather, doesn't succeed in a traditional sense. She is lost and ultimately defeated. But her survival is a deeper commentary on the limits of human endurance and the terrors of the unknown. Into the 2000s and beyond, horror continued to grow, and so did the final girl. In films like The Descent, Cabin in the Woods, and It Follows, the final girl became more than just a trope. She was a fully realized character, complex and nuanced, and often confronting both an internal and an external horror. These final girls were survivors of not just physical violence, but also psychological traumas. For example, in The Descent, Sarah's battle isn't just with the horrific creatures lurking in the cave. It's also with her own guilt and grief after a traumatic loss. In the end, her survival is just as much psychological as it is physical. In Cabin in the Woods, the final girl, Dana, is revealed to be the key to an ancient ritual, offering a type of commentary on horror itself. She is both the victim and the agent of change, a new kind of survivor who frees herself from the genre's predictable patterns. As horror continues to change and expand, so does the role of the final girl. Moving into the more psychological and folk horror films of the 2010s and 2020s, survival becomes less about outsmarting the killer and more about confronting the demons within ourselves or the dark forces of society. The final girl is no longer just fighting for her life. She's now fighting for her identity, her sense of self, and even her own humanity. Looking at Midsummer by Ari Aster, Danny's survival is not as simple as a victory of the killer. It's a transformation, a ritual of rebirth. She emerges from the film as not only a survivor, but as someone who has actively embraced a new, albeit terrifying, role. The final girl of the future will be less about the last one standing, and more about the complex emotional, psychological, and societal forces that shape her journey. Her evolution reflects the evolution of the horror genre itself. It's not just about being scary, but also confronting the dark parts of ourselves and the outside world. As long as horror movies continue to reflect our fears and desires, we'll continue to see her, fighting back, surviving, and reminding us that sometimes the true terrors are what we must overcome within ourselves.